Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich begrüße Sie heute Abend zur zweiten Akademievorlesung, veranstaltet von der Berlin-Brandenburgischen Akademie und ihrer interdisziplinären Arbeitsgruppe zu den Implikationen der Digitalisierung für die Qualität der Wissenschaftskommunikation. Unser Gast heute Abend ist Stephan Lewandowsky. Herr Lewandowsky lehrt und forscht an der School for Psychological Science in Cognitive Psychology an der University of Bristol in England. Er war zuvor an der School of Psychological Science an der University of Western Australia in Perth von 2000 bis 2013. Sein Arbeitsschwerpunkt sind computergestützte Modellierung der Kognition, öffentliches Verständnis und Akzeptanz der Wissenschaft, Desinformation, Aktualisierung des Gedächtnisses und anhaltender Einfluss von Fehlinformationen, sowie die Rolle der wissenschaftlichen Unsicherheit beim Klimawandel. In seinem Blog shapingtomorrowsworld.org schreibt er zum Thema Klimawandel und über andere globale Herausforderungen. In 2011 erhielt er den Discovery Outstanding Researcher Award vom australischen Research Council und 2013 von der Royal Society den Wolfson Research Merit Award und schließlich zuletzt von der Humboldt-Stiftung den Humboldt-Forschungspreis in 2019. Der Vortrag von Herrn Lewandowsky, Race Between Science and Pseudoscience, the digital world from the perspective of cognitive psychology. Stephen, the floor, or the screen rather, is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, especially after I spent 12 hours trying to get to Berlin last week, a week ago today. And I arrived at Berlin airport 45 minutes before the talk was due to start. And so I just couldn't make it despite traveling for more than 12 hours. Anyway, I made it this time by mouse click. I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to telling you a little bit about my impressions of science and pseudoscience in today's world. And I want to start out by providing an overview, a thumbnail sketch of what many people have called the post-truth world. Now, I don't particularly like that term because post-truth seems to imply that there was a time when we were just immersed in truth and nothing else, and we sort of lost that. But when you look at the history of misstatements or lies, misinformation, then it actually isn't the case that politicians were always honest in the past and then somehow stopped doing that. Now, I want to illustrate this using American presidents for the simple reason that they're powerful. We know a lot about them. They're subject to intense scrutiny. And hence, whenever they have a challenging relationship with the truth, we're bound to find out sooner or later. And as you can see here for the last 40 years or so, you know, pretty much every president somewhere along the line committed some fairly substantial dishonesty or spinning or misleading claims, whatever you want to call it. And it doesn't matter, you know, too much what party they belong to, even though four of these people here are Republicans. Bill Clinton was a Democrat, and he got caught lying about his sex life. So we've always had dishonesty. We've always had misleading statements. We've always had lies. And yet, I think something has changed over time. Now, the first thing that's changed is just the sheer quantity of false or misleading claims. I'm picking out Donald Trump again because we have a lot of data about him. And according to fact checkers, he made about 20 false or misleading claims every day during his presidency. So almost 1 per hour, 24/7 for 4 years. Now that's different from any of his predecessors. But what I think is even more important than the quantitative increase is that there has been a qualitative shift in the type of dishonesty or lies that people or presidents at least engaged in. And that shift I characterize as being from systemic lies to what I call shock and chaos disinformation. Let me try and explain that difference, because I think that understanding that difference is crucial for us to understand how science is doing at the moment. Now, by systemic lies, what I mean are falsehoods that are carefully curated. For example, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. As it turns out, they didn't exist after we invaded that country, the United States, UK, and Australia, together with others. But in the build-up to the invasion, there was a very concerted effort to make us believe that these weapons of mass destruction were there. Now, interestingly, none of the people involved disputed the existence of Iraq, for example. They were contesting a shared reality. They just had a different version of what was happening in that reality from what later on turned out to be the case. But it was a form of realism. There was some common denominator. It was tacitly understood that there is a country called Iraq, and that it was just about whether or not they had weapons of mass destruction. Now, I want to argue that's what's happened during the last 10 years or so. There's been a shift away from that to a complete disregard, not just for facts or accuracy, but even the existence or possibility of truth. I call that epistemic insouciance. And one example, one of countless examples, was the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, when his press secretary at the time claimed that the largest crowd ever attended his inauguration. Now, the pictures say otherwise. These are photos of the inauguration, Trump on the left, Barack Obama 4 years prior to that on the right, taken from the same location at exactly the same time at precisely the moment of the inauguration. And it's, you know, there's no question that fewer people attended Trump's than Obama's inauguration. And, you know, to make a false claim like that, that is so blatantly contradicted by evidence within seconds, you know, you don't even have to think about this very hard. That, to my mind, reflects what I call a very different ontology of truth. By that, I mean, it's a very different conception of truth. It's a conception of truth that has given rise to phrases such as alternative facts. You may recall this if you're into American politics, but, you know, when Trump was challenged on this inauguration crowd, you know, one of his spokespeople just said, "Oh, well, we have alternative facts. You know, you may think there were fewer people here, but we have alternative facts." And the second individual, he's British and an instrumental agent in the Brexit event that is now ongoing. You know, he was also very explicit about it. What I call a lie, somebody else calls a fact, and vice versa, as if there is no way to establish common ground and agree on some facts or fact-like things in the world. And of course, this is tremendously convenient, because if that's your ontology of truth, you can ignore any challenge by just saying, "Oh, well, that's fake news. I have alternative facts. Go away. I can think whatever I want." Now, what's also concerning in this more recent epistemic insouciance among populist politicians in particular, not just Donald Trump, but elsewhere, is that some of the lies have no apparent specific purpose. That is, Donald Trump lied, simply lied, about things that were of no consequence to him. You know, he said he was in the White House all weekend when he was playing golf. Well, you know, it didn't really matter whether he was in the White House or playing golf. Why would he make this stuff up? Well, I think we have to understand that because there's a deep shift in the public's perception of honesty underlying that. So, for example, what I'm showing you here are Donald Trump's approval ratings throughout his presidency, and they're basically flat. I mean, he wasn't terribly popular, but, you know, nearly half the people thought he was doing an okay job. And in fact, at no point in his presidency did he lose support among Republicans. More than 3/4 of Republicans supported him throughout. The lowest he got was 77%. And 3/4 of Republicans considered Trump to be honest. That was also done repeatedly throughout his presidency. It isn't just a one-time observation. But among Republicans, 3/4, roughly, considered Donald Trump to be honest. And this now is a real problem. It's a serious cognitive or psychological problem, to my mind, that people call somebody honest who by anybody's account is speaking untruths and makes misleading statements 20 times a day. So why? Well, there's a number of explanations for this that have been advanced. The one that I want to put forward, because it's the one I prefer for a number of reasons, is that of the key concept of authenticity. Now, I've already mentioned that Trump stated falsehoods about public events that were really easily debunked in no time at all. It wasn't even subtle. And in so doing, I would argue that he was flagrantly flouting norms of truth-telling. Now, those norms, those conventions, are set by the establishment. We live in a society in which it is established wisdom that, you know, you should be honest, you should be educated, you should work hard, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There are these sort of conventions and norms in our societies. And what Donald Trump did was to just flout them and just say, oh, well, I don't care. I'm going to lie, because every time I lie, I'm signaling that I'm an authentic champion of the real people who are opposing these elites or the establishment. And that is the essence, really, of populism, populist politics, that there's a division between the elites on one hand and the people on the other. Of course, it's a completely artificial distinction. It doesn't exist, but it is one that populists create. And the moment you live within this binary world, then if people question the legitimacy of a system, of a country, or an election, or whatever it is, then any norm violation signals authenticity to them. So if Donald Trump says more people came to my inauguration than Barack Obama's, then that's not interpreted as the lie that it is, but it is interpreted as a signal. This guy is with us because he's really, you know, he's telling the establishment to get lost and replace, you know, his own version of reality. So that I think is what is happening, and we know that from experiments done by Hall et al. There's a very, very nice paper that looked at this, showing that you can turn on and off this effect of people accepting authenticity as a replacement for accuracy in political situations. And I think that is what's happened in the United States among, well, certainly during Trump's presidency. It continues to happen among Republicans. It is continuing to happen in the United Kingdom, where I live, which has unmoored itself in public discourse from any reality that I can discern. And in Brazil, under Bolsonaro, and so on, wherever populists are in power or trying to be, that is what they will do. It's not a coincidence. It is a technique to signal to their followers their authenticity and their opposition to the establishment. Now, If it were just politicians, then maybe you could say, oh, okay, well, that's too bad, but somehow move on. Well, the problem is it isn't just politicians. It is also people themselves. Here are these inauguration photos again, now presented to participants in an online experiment as stimuli. The study was done right after the inauguration, so early 2017. And the participants' task was very simple. Click on the picture that has more people in it. Now, you can't really get that wrong, or can you? Well, here are the data on the left. This is the percentage of people choosing photo A as having more people in it. Now, that's wrong. There's no ambiguity here. It's completely wrong. And people who didn't vote, or Clinton voters at the time, never made that mistake. The tiny error rates here are just sort of slips of the finger, or, you know, the cat walked on the keyboard or something. You know, these are random errors. But for Trump voters, these are not random errors. Not at all. Quite on the contrary, for highly educated Trump voters, that's not a random error. That means that 1 in 4, roughly 26% of the time, they will choose photo A, which they know has fewer people in it. Why? Well, because in so doing, they're expressing support for their leader, and they're willing to engage in this participatory propaganda. That's the term I like to use for that, which basically means that people are knowingly spreading and sharing falsehoods or expressing falsehoods. Now, that didn't last forever. A student of mine and I, we replicated the same experiment about 2 years later. And by that time, the controversy had gone, and Republicans all of a sudden had perfect eyesight again, and they didn't pick the wrong picture. They expressed their support for Trump in other ways, namely thinking that the audience was the same size as Barack Obama's, but they no longer picked the wrong picture. So there's pretty good evidence that this was, at the time, an expression of Trump supporters' support for their candidate, and they had no hesitation, well, at least a quarter of them didn't, to engage in participatory propaganda. Now, that's my thumbnail sketch of the post-truth world, or what people call the post-truth world, which isn't entirely post-truth in the sense that we've sort of lost something we had. We've always had dishonesty. But what has changed is the sheer magnitude and the quality of political dishonesty and misleading statements, and the public's willingness, at least part of the public's willingness to participate in that. Certainly in the United States, and I would argue in the United Kingdom as well. I think Germany has been spared that experience to a great extent, but as we probably all know, not entirely either. So, what are the broader consequences of this post-truth world? Because we now have to talk about how science fits into this, and what are scientists going to do? How are we going to communicate science in a post-truth world? Well, again, looking at the United States, looking at American data, what I'm showing you here are public opinion data over, a decade or so almost, concerning universities and colleges, higher education. And what you can see that if you ask Democrats, that about, at least 2/3 of them view universities and colleges as a positive thing. Higher education is good. And only, roughly a fifth or even less think of it as having a negative influence on the country. Okay. Now look at Republicans. Until 2015, they too thought that higher education was good. Not nearly as much as Democrats. They were more critical. More than a third of Republicans, even back then, held a negative opinion of universities and colleges. But still, they were leaning towards endorsing education. And then that flipped around. Now, what do you think happened between 2015 and 2017? Well, I don't think universities changed that much. In fact, I guarantee you that they didn't, because universities are very slow-moving institutions. I know that from experience. There wasn't a radical shift in American universities in 2 years. What there was a radical shift in leadership. And as I already said, one of the defining characteristics of populist politicians is to violate any establishment norm. And of course, universities are part of the elite or the establishment. And so there was a very systematic effort that is ongoing to denigrate higher education. And it's happening in the United Kingdom as well. And so that is the problem in which the scientific community finds itself now, the context in which it finds itself, and that it has to deal with. Now, I want to examine the reasons why people are susceptible to these shifts in opinions towards science and higher education. I mean, yeah, okay, there's leadership. So if your leader tells you you shouldn't trust universities, maybe you go along. But really, is that all there is to it, or is there more? Now, the first possibility I want to examine is what I call a pragmatic opposition to science. What does that mean? Well, that means that there are certain scientific facts that are really inconvenient. Climate change is one of them. Who likes climate change? No one. I've never met anybody who likes it. Why would I like something that is a really serious problem and that we can only cope with by changing our way of life and the way our economy works? Hey, I could do without that. So it's understandable that people would oppose climate science, and it's particularly understandable that they would do so more the more they are committed to this idea of a free market. And what I'm showing you here is the strength of association from one of my studies between people's endorsement of a free market and their attitudes towards climate science. These are American data, and these are actually synthetic data, but they have precisely the characteristic of the real data, namely a very strong negative association. And from that, I know that if I know how much people love the free market, I can have a very good idea about what they're, how little they're going to believe climate science. And this is replicated countless times. It doesn't matter how you measure people's worldview or politics. You can go by party identification, by free market endorsement, the way I did here. You can look at conservatism, various other social psychological constructs. Doesn't matter. You always get the same result, which, in a sense, makes perfect sense. Because if free markets are important to you, then climate change is awful, particularly awful. And here's one more study that's shown this across 24 countries. And what you can see here is that in the United States, that relationship is particularly strong. The more conservative, the more to the right, the more people will deny climate change. If you go across all 24 countries, the effect is slightly smaller, but it's nonetheless there. And now, let's turn to COVID. Well, COVID came along, 18 months ago. And from the beginning, I thought of it as climate change on steroids, because it is a risk that requires a change in behavior to be managed, a very significant change in behavior. It was damaging the economy. It was curtailing people's individual liberties if you wanted to manage it. And all that had to be done in over days or weeks, not months or years. And guess what? Conservatives and libertarians have been the ones most opposed to social distancing measures. They're also the ones most likely to share conspiracy theories and other misinformation about COVID. And it translates into behavior. You can actually show that counties in the United States that voted for Trump rather than Clinton, they complied less with social distancing, which led to more cases, hospitalizations, and ultimately deaths. So there is, again, a very strong political component in this opposition to science. And, at first glance, at this point, I would look at that and say, well, yeah, of course, climate change and COVID do have these common attributes that they require interference with people's way of life. And conservatives or libertarians who are particularly committed to that, therefore, should be particularly averse to the solutions and hence be prepared to deny the science. So maybe this is just pragmatic opposition. Maybe that's one way of looking at it, that in these particular instances, climate change and COVID, conservatives and libertarians are just caught between accepting something really, really inconvenient or supporting their own commitments to a free market. Well, but that doesn't quite cover it, because when we turn to vaccinations, this whole thing breaks down, I think. Because vaccinations are our ticket out of the pandemic and our ticket to freedom. If we all get vaccinated, then we will eventually get out of the pandemic. It's as simple as that. And I mean, it's obvious, the more people are vaccinated, the fewer restrictions you need. You still need some, but at least you can get out of the pandemic. So shouldn't conservatives and libertarians line up to get vaccinated? It's their ticket to freedom. It's their ticket out of this dreadful mess. Well, it turns out, no. These are data from April. I haven't looked at it recently, so this was 6 months ago, but the phenomenon is absolutely striking. What I'm showing you here are vaccination rates between US states, shown in the panel here on the right. And it is also showing whether the states voted for Trump or Biden. We have Biden blue on the left, and we have Trump red on the right. And the redder the state, the more Republican, the more votes for Trump, the fewer people are vaccinated. And that is a striking relationship. I mean, there's a difference here of 40 percentage points between Mississippi and New Hampshire. I mean, that's big. That is a big effect. And precisely the same effect is shown in opinion data, where you ask people if they're hesitant to take the COVID vaccine. So it flips around, because here on the left, the higher up, the more hesitant. So the directionality is different, but it's the same idea. It's the same thing. The more people voted for Trump, the more hesitant they are towards the ticket to freedom. Well, so what's going on here? Well, what I think is going on here is a general opposition to science or vaccinations that comes with populist politics. These data are from Europe a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic. And if you look at vaccine hesitancy, which is what's plotted here, as a function of the vote share for populist parties, you find this amazing, strong relationship, just as we've seen across United US states. We find it here across EU member states. Now, I looked at this at the level of individuals, and I want to briefly walk you through 3 studies that we've conducted, each involving more than 1,000 Americans, where we looked at people's attitudes towards vaccinations. Pre-pandemic now, these are just generic questions about vaccines, and various potential predictors of these attitudes, various different, political variables. And to make a long story short, these are the associations between people's politics and their attitudes towards vaccinations. Now, free market means people endorse free market economics to varying extents. Conservatism is just another scale of various items where people indicate how conservative or liberal they are. And the main message from this table here is that there are some numbers that are negative. Negative means the more conservative or the more free market, the less you will endorse vaccinations. Now, these numbers are smaller than for climate change, but they're consistently negative. And here's another study also done by Matt Hornsey, another set of 24 countries, thousands of participants. And as you can see, the consistent pattern across countries is that the more conservative people are, the more vaccine hesitant they are. If there was no association, you would be at 0. That's the vertical line. But overall, there's a very clear effect. There is an association between politics and vaccine hesitancy, precisely what I found in our studies. And this then presents us with a bit of a conundrum, because now I'm thinking, well, hang on, why do libertarians oppose the solution to their problems? I mean, COVID, opposing social distancing and masks, that's one thing because it infringes with my personal liberty. But hey, vaccinations, well, why? That sort of runs counter to this pragmatic thing. And in fact, if you look at the literature carefully, and I've done this, for many years now, it is quite difficult in the United States, in large samples, to find science denial on the political left. There are anecdotal reports, and certainly, I can think of left-wingers who are not, very generous in their attitudes towards science. But in the data, it doesn't show up if you do representative surveys. Why? What is it about conservatism, libertarianism, that seemingly predisposes people towards rejection of scientific evidence? Why? Well, I think that's one way to phrase the question. But I'd like to flip it around. I want to flip it around. I want to ask, well, what is it science has done that makes conservatives rejected? Let's look at science. Let's not look at conservatives. Let's look at science. What has science done? Well, there are 2 things that come to mind. The first one is that if you look at what science has done over the last, 300 or 400 years, it's taken human beings from being the crown of creation, made in God's image, at the center of the universe, and it's put us onto the very average rock running around a very average star in an average galaxy. I mean, we're definitely not at the center of the universe. I mean, we're sort of a far suburb out, a completely average small town in the prairies somewhere. Now, that is challenging for people who believe that humans are special for religious reasons, for example. For them, that's incredibly challenging to accept that. So why would they like science if it is undermining something that is extremely important to them, which is the special status of human beings? Well, that's just the beginning. Now, there's more. What else does science do? Well, science has norms in the same way I mentioned norms before, in the same way that societies have practices and conventions and norms. So does science. And what are those norms? Well, here's a few of them that were proposed, 80 years ago by Merton, but that still hold and that scientists actually, to this date, at least partially internalize. One of them, the first one, is disinterestedness. That is that research is supposed to be done for the benefit of science rather than personal gain. Wow, that's fraying around the edges these days, but it certainly was part of the scientific ethos for a long time. And communism, just think of the name. God, how can you call something communism? Well, communism in this instance means that the results of research are the common property of the scientific community. I publish something so everybody knows about it. That's the whole point. It's no longer mine. It is everybody's. Knowledge is universally shared. And it doesn't matter whether the person who discovers something is black or white or green or male or female or both or whatever. It doesn't matter once something is published. I'm not saying there aren't problems within science relating to gender and nationality and all that, but once something is out there, no one knows. And the knowledge transcends these political barriers. Now, if you look at that, does this sound conservative to you? Well, I don't think so. Certainly in the Anglo-Saxon, British, American, Australian definition of conservatism, there is a clash here between the norms of science and things like nationalism, libertarianism, the profit motive, property rights. There's a tension here between these norms of science and deep elements of conservative thought. So, does that mean that maybe there is a deep conflict between science and conservatism? Well, I would argue yes, in part. And I'm arguing that on the basis of two studies that Klaus Oberauer and I published earlier this year, where we looked at people's attitudes towards two scientific propositions, climate change and vaccinations. We actually had three, but I don't have time to talk about the third one. And we looked at potential predictors of attitudes towards those scientific propositions. Now, I only have time to tell you about one of the two studies where we measured people's conservatism directly, and we also measured their attitudes towards the norms of science. How did people feel about those norms, and did they think that scientists should act according to those norms? I'm not going to explain social dominance. I don't have to. It's not necessary for my main argument. My main argument is based on these numbers here. Now, there's a bunch of numbers. A lot of them, I'll walk through it very slowly just to make sure we're all comfortable with that. So the first thing we find, and this is now 1,000 people answering all these questions relating to these different scientific propositions and their own attitudes, what we find is that there's an association between climate change and vaccinations. It's reasonably large. What does that mean? That means that people who accept climate change also accept that vaccines are safe and helpful and, in favor of public health and so on. That's replicating previous results, which tends to show that people's attitudes towards science clusters together. People who accept one science also accept another scientific propositions. We also find, perhaps unsurprisingly, a very strong, quite respectable association between endorsement of the norms of science and people's attitudes towards those two scientific propositions, meaning that the more people think that, yes, scientists should be disinterested and knowledge should be universal, et cetera, the more people endorse that, the more likely they are to accept climate change and vaccinations. And if you look at our two indicators of conservatism. I haven't explained social dominance. I don't have to. Let's just look at conservatism. Hey, guess what? We're replicating precisely these very strong negative associations between conservatism and climate change and vaccinations. Okay, I've already mentioned that. There's nothing new here. What is new is the last set of numbers, and that's the one I was particularly interested in from the outset. And that is the association between people's politics and their endorsement of the norms of science. And what we find here is substantial negative associations between those political constructs and endorsement of the norms of science, which is precisely what you would expect if you look at the norms of science and compare them to conservative thought. Well, yeah, people who self-identify as conservatives will then also be less likely to accept that scientists are disinterested and that knowledge is universal and that nationality doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. So the conclusion that the tentative conclusion that we draw from that is that there may be a potential conflict between the norms of science and conservative values. Now, that doesn't mean a conservative cannot be a scientist. No, of course not. It just simply means that statistically, on average, there is this tension between conservative values and the scientific enterprise. And this conflict may explain why conservatives in so many studies across so many domains are more likely to reject scientific findings than people on the left. Now, I should add that this is all culturally specific, and unless otherwise noted, all my data are with American samples. I've shown you a few things that went across 24 different countries and showed the same pattern. So there is some generality to this, I'm sure, but until, let's say we've replicated this in Germany or Austria or whatever, I'm very cautious in claiming that you would find the same thing. We really have to look at each culture separately, because that matters a great deal, because a lot of this is conditioned by the circumstances people live in. Now, these underlying tensions between the norms of science and conservatism, combined with the post-truth world that is adding on top of that this replacement of accuracy with authenticity, that taken together has created a perfect storm, I think, in my opinion, that makes it extremely difficult to communicate or derive policies on the basis of scientific evidence in some countries, in particular, the United States. So what are we going to do now? Well, the first question one might ask is, well, why am I going on about this? Why is understanding conservatism or worldviews generally, why is that important? Well, I think there are two answers. The first one is sort of, to me obvious, because it's very interesting and fascinating to understand, and we have to understand this because it is problematic. But the second reason is that it can help us communicate better with conservatives, or for that matter, liberals, for anyone. Now, when I talk about there being a tension between norms of science and conservatism, or that conservatives reject science, let me remind you, these are all statistical associations. They don't necessarily mean that every conservative will reject science. Of course not, but just on average, they're a little more likely than liberals. So how do we then talk to them? Of course you can talk to conservatives about science, but how can you do that? Well, I would argue that one thing that is really important in this is to coordinate or align the worldviews of the messenger with that of the audience. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a terrific experiment done by Dan Cahan about 10 years ago. It dealt with the HPV vaccine, the vaccine against cervical cancer. And he was in the experiment was presenting participants with these 4 fictitious people. These are just random pictures from Google Images or something, but they were presented as being real, and they were purportedly the authors of these books. Now, I'm only going to focus on this dude up here and that guy down there for simplicity. This fella here has written books called The Immigrant Invasion, Threatening the American Way of Life, The War on American Manhood, and it goes on. I think you get the picture. You know who that is. And this guy down here was equally a caricature. You know, he's written books called Three Social Evils: Sexism, Racism, and Homophobia, Raising Children, Avoiding Sexual Stereotypes. You know exactly that this guy is a hippie, right? You can hear, you know, you can just see him eating his tofu, and that was the whole point of the experiment, to create these stereotypes of what I call a hippie and a free marketeer, only for labeling, you know, to make it easy to label these people. So we have these 2 different worldviews in these purported messengers, and we have an audience that is similarly classified on the basis of a questionnaire into being hippies or free marketeers. Again, that's a simplification, but the labels are sticky and easy to use. And then these participants were exposed to pro and anti-vaccination messages presented by these messengers who were either aligned as expected or not. Now, what does it mean to be aligned as expected? Well, the expected alignment is for the free marketeer to say, do not vaccinate your daughters because it'll encourage them to have sex. And the hippie is expected to say, oh, vaccinate your daughters, they'll have sex anyway, they might as well be safe. Okay, those are the sort of stereotypical attitudes expected as aligned. In another condition, that was flipped around. So the free marketeer unexpectedly said, oh, yeah, you got to get your daughters vaccinated. And the hippie said, no, whatever, for whatever reason, they shouldn't vaccinate. Now look at what happens. Now, as I said, this is a very complicated experiment. I tried my best to simplify it as much as possible. And what I'm showing you here, these 3 numbers, are polarization scores. What does that mean? That means this is how far apart the participants who were hippies were from the participants who were free marketeers, for lack of a better label. Okay, and if they were exposed to the vaccine information, there was on a 3-point scale, there was quite a bit of polarization. You know, 0.57 out of 3. That's a fair amount. So they were apart in their attitudes towards the HPV vaccine. Okay, now if you then present them with the information with an alignment as expected. So the hippie says, go vaccinate, and the free marketeer says, don't vaccinate. Then the 2 audience segments move apart further. They're now at 0.83. Now that's actually, you know, that's a lot of polarization, a lot of difference between these 2 groups of participants. Now look at the final number. If you flip it around, then the polarization almost disappears. They now have the same attitude. Why? Well, because each tribe, each part of the audience follows their leader to wherever that leader is taking them, either further apart, so they polarize, or closer together, so the polarization is gone. The whole point of showing this is to show the power of a culturally aligned messenger. So if you have a messenger who can talk to their own culture, they can be extremely effective, even in a context that is politically controversial, and even in an adversarial environment where people are highly polarized to begin with. So the key thing, I would argue, in science communication, one of the key things is to align the messenger, but also the messages with a worldview of the audience. Different audiences take completely different messages. Of course, you have to present the same science, but you can still present the information differently, framed to align with the culture of the audience. All right, so that's a little bit of help. That's where how we can deal with communication. Now, in closing, the last point I want to talk about is misinformation, again, in the scientific context, and how much misinformation in a scientific context affects people's behavior. I'm returning to COVID because that's, the scientific issue of the day, and we know a lot about it. For example, that watching Fox News in the US has been causally linked to reduced compliance with social distancing. It's not surprising if you know what Fox News did, at least early on. They were downplaying the pandemic and effectively turned it political, saying the Democrats are using it against Trump. So they took out the public health and inserted the politics in their coverage, and that had a big effect on behavior. Now, in experiments, similarly, if you expose people to misinformation about vaccines, then unsurprisingly, the intention to get vaccinated decreases quite, substantially. 6% is a, notable effect, especially if you scale it up to the population at large. Now, here's the problem with misinformation. Misinformation sticks. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you encounter fake news, such as that the Pope endorses Donald Trump, and you then encounter a correction to that, you may still continue to rely on that misinformation, even if you know and you tell me that that was false. Why? Well, that is because as people go through the world and they're listening to messages or reading about them, they're building a mental model. They're building an event model of the world, a coherent story of what is happening in the world. And if all of a sudden I say, that's false, what are you going to do? You have this edifice of a situation model that you've built in your mind. I'm now ripping out a plank. What are you going to do? I mean, the whole thing collapses if that crucial element has been withdrawn. So what do I do? Well, what people do is to say on the one hand, oh, yeah, I know you told me that's false and I believe you. But on the other hand, they're relying on the misinformation whenever they make inferences or whenever they're asked about it indirectly, because it is just extremely difficult to update memory. And this has nothing to do with politics or vaccine attitudes. This is before we get there, before we get to the politics, that people are challenged by this idea of disregarding misinformation. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is to resort to something known as inoculation. Inoculation is a psychological technique where people are exposed to how they will be misled before they're exposed to the misinformation. So we train people to recognize when they might be misled. This has been shown to work across the entire political spectrum. And the last study I want to tell you about briefly is something we did recently I did it recently with 2 students, where we presented in the treatment condition, we presented people with a brief video, about 3 minutes, that told them about these 3 techniques by which people try to undermine confidence in vaccines: evoking emotion, telling people to do their own research. Just go on Google. Don't trust the doctors. You can become a medical scientist by going to Google. And jumping to conclusions, cherry picking, and then hasty generalizations, jumping to conclusions from individual instances. And we used these videos on a large number of UK residents who were unvaccinated at the time, but neutral in their attitudes towards vaccinations. We then exposed our participants to misinformation, dressed up as a WhatsApp message, and we made sure that they read those messages. And we then asked them to discern what technique they had just been exposed to. In other words, we asked them to make a judgment about each of these WhatsApp messages. How good was it? Do I believe it? What about my vaccine concern? Will I share it, et cetera, et cetera? We asked all these questions. And the crucial result is whether the inoculation, that's the video treatment where we told people how to detect misinformation, whether that allowed them to discern the technique and what that might do to their concern about the vaccines. And what you can see here is that in comparison to a control condition, after this inoculation through the training video, there's a significant and considerable boost in people's ability to identify misleading techniques. And their concern about getting vaccinated is also reduced simply because they recognize that some of the information they're exposed to can be misleading. So that is just in a nutshell one of many, many experiments where we can show that inoculation works in the sense that it can protect people against being misinformed. And with that, I come to the end, and hopefully lots of questions, which I hope you can put in the Q&A box. And really what I wanted to do today is to draw this picture of the post-truth world, which has this crucial aspect that authenticity has become more important than factual accuracy. And that is a perfect breeding ground for dismissal of science, especially if you add it together with this other issue, which is that there's a tension between the norms of science and conservatism. How can we overcome that? Well, through culturally aligned messaging and by using things such as inoculation. That's not the only one. Let me finish off showing you my last slide. There's lots of other things we can do to communicate and to deal with misinformation and indeed conspiracy theories. And these links here are to a set of 3 handbooks that my colleagues and I have published. They're free. They're also available in German. I think all 3 of them, they've been translated into many languages, certainly including German. Check it out. And they're full of practical sort of recommendations for how to deal with the post-truth world and science. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope we'll have plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
First of all, there is a question. I read it out. On the reason conservatives don't like science, could it be that scientists en bloc are perceived as part of the outgroup and are summarily grouped under the label liberal or whatever? Not sure it is based on the reflection of Merton's norms of science. Or would you say that becoming a scientist means being selected by an implicit compatibility of their attitudes with Merton's norms? That is, even if they never heard of Merton in their lives. This is a question by Reinhold.
Yeah, I saw that from Reinhold. Hi, Reinhold. Yeah, excellent question. I mean, certainly conservatives in the United States do accuse academics of being liberal, and there's a left-wing bias and a liberal bias and all that sort of thing. And so, yes, they would certainly argue that. The evidence for that is actually pretty scant. And there are some academic departments where you will find a lot of conservatives, you know, try economics or engineering. So this whole thing about a liberal bias in academia, I think, is a little bit inflated, but that's a separate issue. What that doesn't explain is that sudden shift I showed you between 2015 and 2017, when Republicans flipped around completely in their endorsement of science. I mean, you know, there was no change in the liberal bias in universities in those 2 years. They talked about it as much before as they do now. There was no change in that. So something else had to happened. And I'm willing to speculate it was Donald Trump. So yeah, of course, you may well say that Republicans don't like science because they're all liberal. However, as I already said, there is that flip around that's hard to explain. The second thing that's hard to explain is that if you look at longitudinal data, up until roughly the 1970s, Republicans trusted scientists more than Democrats. We have longitudinal data on that. And it's only from the 1970s onward that there was this shift. Now, what I think has happened there is that that was the time when science all of a sudden became dissociated from technological progress. Scientists weren't just building bigger and better rockets and cars. They were all of a sudden discovering pollution, for example. DDT was a bad thing, or arguably, you know, it depends on how you use it and all that. But there were negative side effects. Tobacco all of a sudden became bad for you. And it was these dreadful scientists who discovered that. So I think what happened is that science became more and more inconvenient over time. And yeah, well, maybe scientists became inconvenient because they're all liberals, but I don't know. I think climate change and DDT are unfolding whether there's a liberal bias in science or not. So that's the first answer. The second thing about the Merton's norms of science, yeah, it's a very interesting point. Of course, most of my colleagues I talk to have never heard of Merton either. However, if you ask them differently, and if you give them surveys about what they think science should be like, or what they feel is appropriate scientific conduct, then you find that they internalize these norms, even if you've never heard of Merton. But if you become a scientist, then you end up more or less, more often than not, thinking that knowledge belongs to everybody and shouldn't be somebody's property. And I can send you the link to the paper that's done that. This was from a little while ago. I have no idea if you know, in 2021, that's still the case right now, this very instant. But there's certainly plenty of evidence that scientists have internalized those norms until, you know, at least, you know, 10 years ago or something.
Let me follow up with another question by Reinhold. Is there evidence that Facebook and Twitter increase the polarization with respect to science, in an analogy to Horgan's testimony about the role of Instagram with respect to body images, etc.?
Yeah. Well, that's again a very good question. What's the best way to answer that? Okay, there's certainly been a lot of analysis of Twitter discourse on vaccinations and climate change. And one of the things you find is that there is a lot of bot activity that is doing anti-vax messaging on Twitter. So clearly the social media plays some role in this, in all of this. There's also evidence from, fairly recently, that Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook are all still highlighting misinformation about COVID and vaccinations and climate change. I can think of various papers that were published on that by Avaz, incidentally, which is an activist organization, AVAAZ. But whatever they are, they do surprisingly, well, I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, surprisingly good research, very, very thorough. And I find their reports trustworthy. And they showed a lot of uncontrolled misinformation on these major platforms. The flip side of this is, and that's why it's a difficult story, the flip side is that Facebook and YouTube, they all have come down harder on conspiracy theories relating to COVID and to vaccinations in particular. Now, they probably haven't done enough, but they have done something. And that actually is demonstrably effective, I find. There's pretty good evidence, to my satisfaction, that deplatforming some of the egregious conspiratorial content means that people no longer find out about it and they don't care about it. It doesn't mean that it goes underground and percolates around. It just simply means it disappears. So taking things down by YouTube has a very positive effect, no question.
Okay, next question by Jochen Laubrock. Thanks for the interesting talk and data, Stephen. What do you think is the psychological reason for denying science, etc.? Do you think that science poses a threat to simpler belief systems conservatives prefer? Do you think that threat is too strong, so a sort of cognitive dissonance arises? Do we need more aligned science, mass education, science evangelists? And a philosophical question, which I don't expect to be answered, why do people need simple belief systems at all? What is the real deep-rooted fear that leads to the acceptance of simple belief systems?
That's a good one. The last one is, oh God, yeah, well, I mean, I don't really want to get too much into that last question, but if you're interested in it, I suggest you look up terror management theory, TMT, terror management theory. And that is one of the sources where, you know, it's all about people managing their terror of death. And one of the ways they do that is by having these simple belief systems that give them comfort. But that, I don't want to get too deep into that. Well, what you said in your question is, of course, completely correct. Yeah, the reason people reject science is because it threatens them on a you know, number of different levels. I mean, let's go back to climate change. If I want to drive a big car and fly to Bali for my holiday, then climate change threatens me. Well, what threatens me is our response to climate change, which should involve me buying an electric car and maybe not flying to Bali every week. So there's a threat there. And we know from the data that what triggers people's denial or rejection of science very often is aversion to the solution, not the problem, but the solution. So in other words, you know, a lot of Republicans would probably be perfectly happy with climate change and accepting the science if the solution was some sort of, you know, the tooth fairy or something that doesn't do them any harm. You know, you just wave a magic wand and they would be happy. So it's the solution that causes the problem. There's clear evidence of that. And of course, the threat then goes on, you know, it's threat to your worldview. If the scientists are, you know, sharing their knowledge rather than keeping it and selling it to each other, you know, well, if I'm a libertarian purist, then I might find that very difficult because it's violating my deeply held beliefs. So there are threats at multiple levels.
Okay, there is the next question by Nikola Mocek. What happened in 2015 that might lead to the abrupt change in the Republicans' attitudes towards colleges? This pattern is quite unusual.
Yes.
I'd like to read the source.
Yes, it's very unusual. Well, if you remember the data, there was a data point in 2015. There was another one in 2017. So what happened in between 2015 and 2017. And what happened was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. That's what I would argue is what's going on there. Because, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very unusual to find these rapid shifts. And here's another interesting statistic. During the same time period, Republicans' approval rating of Vladimir Putin went from tiny 10% to 30%. Okay, it jumped 20 percentage points. Now, for the Republicans to approve of a Russian president after 50 years of Cold War is miraculous, and it happened at exactly the same time period. And well, I would identify the same causal variable, which is called Donald Trump. who else would have made Republicans become so much more favorable towards Vladimir Putin? So there are these remarkable shifts in Republican attitudes that you can pinpoint around that time when Donald Trump appeared on the scene. And there's other evidence of the importance of leadership in all this, which I think is undervalued. Not the evidence, well, the evidence as well as the importance of it. For example, in climate change, Robert Bruley, who's a sociologist, has done some great work showing how the polarization around climate change, in part, arose because the Republican leadership retreated from the issue. Don't forget that it wasn't that long ago that there was a bipartisan consensus, sort of, that climate change was a real problem and we had to do something about it. McCain and I forget now, the McCain somebody bill was put before Congress. McCain, of course, being Republican, McCain Markey, some time ago. That was bipartisan. And at the time, there wasn't as much polarization as there is now. And the reason for the polarization is because the Republican leadership said, whoa, okay, we're no longer pushing climate change, walked away from it. So leadership matters a great deal. And you could create a counterfactual world in which there are Republican leaders who have different attitudes towards education and climate change and all that. And they would be, I can guarantee you, they would be able to pull along their partisans considerably.
Okay, right now I don't see any other questions on the Q&A. Let me ask you a question, Stephen. Well, first of all, when you showed us the two pictures of the crowds at the inaugurations of Obama and Trump, the first question that immediately arises in my mind is, even if one assumes, as you do, that the people who claim that the picture A contained more visitors or participants than picture B, I wonder if you would confront a person that says that, who is, moderately educated. Wouldn't you get scared, as that person, would you get scared by just simply pointing to the number of dots that represent visitors? Wouldn't you get scared of being told you're an idiot?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, I can't answer that because I wasn't, and that time in history has long passed. As I showed you, we didn't replicate that 2 years later because the controversy had passed. And by the way, what's his name? Sean Spicer, the press secretary, actually apologized for having said that. He said, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. I was too much of a lie. Even for me. He didn't say that additional stuff, but he said, I shouldn't have done that. So what happens if you confront people with corrections? It's a very interesting question. Now, I looked at this in my own experiments, but there's also literature on this in the context of conspiracy theories, which I review in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. And by the way, I put all those links to the handbooks in the chat. And what you find is that even with conspiracy theorists, you can actually intervene and say, whoa, hang on, no, this isn't right, that isn't right. Why don't you have another think? And it turns out that a surprisingly large number of people are susceptible to that intervention. It is not the case that every single person who says climate change is a hoax will remain committed to that for the rest of their lives. That's just not the case. People are malleable and willing to be corrected, many of them, but not all of them. And so there is certainly a hardcore of people who become extremely angry if you try to challenge them, and they dig themselves in deeper and show reactance, the classic resistance to being told what to do. And they they're actually a small number, but they're the ones who are most active on social media and who are loudest and whom the media give the most attention to. So you can often get a very mistaken impression of how responsive people are if you just look at these extremes. A primary example to me in recent times is the response to vaccine mandates. Now, COVID vaccine mandates. Now, in the US, there were, there's education districts like in Washington, D.C. and New York City and, other places where teachers and nurses and firemen and policemen have to get vaccinated. Otherwise, they lose their job, right? So it's a strict mandate. And there was media coverage about, 133, whatever, teachers or somebody in Washington, D.C. refuses to get vaccinated. Well, it turns out that is 1/10 of 1% of the workforce, right? And they get the headline. Now, the other 99.9% have been vaccinated and kept their jobs. And that is true in so many places that if you look at the effectiveness of mandates, they're actually very effective. The people who don't like them are very loud and hate them a great deal. And I'm not dismissing that entirely, but I think we have to be careful we don't overweight that. So that's a long answer to your question, but it's not everybody will dig themselves in deeper if you talk to them in a empathic manner without insulting them. So I'll stop there. There's more to say, but I think that's a first approximation to an answer.
Before I let Reinhold come up with his next question, let me ask you and one other one that I'm concerned with, and that is you attributed a lot of importance in your explanations to the term of authenticity or the phenomenon of authenticity, and I wonder, is there any research on how people perceive authenticity and what are the dimensions of authenticity as it is such a central term to your?
Okay. No, that's a very good question. What's the easiest way to answer that? The easiest way to answer that is that people consider somebody to be authentic who has the front door and the back door is the same. In other words, what they say in private is the same as what they say in public. And they're not kind of twisting and turning and hedging what they say in public while saying something different in the back. That I think is where authenticity comes in. But that's one dimension of authenticity. And that is what Hillary Clinton was so bad at. She was saying one thing in public and she was saying sort of the same thing in private, but not really as much as you would have liked to bankers or whatever. And then the recording became available of this. And then all of a sudden people said, she's a hypocrite. And, Donald Trump doesn't have that problem. He tweets while he was on Twitter, he tweeted whatever he felt like. In the moment, there was no question that he was like, it's like having a kid, It's like you always know what they're thinking because they're not holding back. And I think Trump had that incredible appeal to people because they knew that. And they didn't care that he was lying. Because
which of course is a delusion. It's the authentic people, the people who seem to be authentic, of course, are also strategizing, and are, we know.
Oh, indeed, and Trump played the media like a piano. I just published a paper last year on that, showing how his tweets diverted media attention.
Okay,
absolutely, it was sort of an act, but it was a damn good act, and. So I think that's one core aspect of authenticity. And the other thing, of course, is the signaling of an authentic commitment to a certain type of person. And again, Trump was a master in that. He really signaled to his base, "I'm with you." That he, in fact, wasn't at all is completely irrelevant to this. It is just he projected that sense of being authentically on their side. And the moment you do that, well, here's the interesting thing. This works when people are disenfranchised or feel left behind in the current system. That is when they will accept an authentic demagogue who's lying all the time. If you remove that condition, if people do not feel left behind, but if they feel that they have a stake in a system and that they can trust their government and that the government is trusting them, then these demagogues don't find traction. And we can, in experiments, you can turn that on and off simply by creating a scenario where people either feel left out or not. So there are conditions under which this works, but unfortunately, those conditions are prevailing in the United States for many people and in the United Kingdom. And that's the real problem.
We have three more questions. The first one by Reinhold, whom I have kept. Let's try to be short on them because we're approaching 1830. Of course, we agree that Trump is a symptom of the very serious concern that there is a much larger segment of the populations all over the world feeling threatened by globalism that found a voice in Trump and other populists. Should we not work on this problem of finding a balance between the Lexus and the olive tree?
Yes.
Thomas Friedman.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That follows from everything I just said. I totally agree. I mean, what we really have to deal with to get rid of the post-truth world is to identify the drivers of it, which are somewhere completely different. They're in economics, they're in identity in part, but also economics. Inequality is a driver of populism. Statistically has been identified as a driver of populism. Job security, all of those things that actually matter to people's lives, they're the things that need fixing. And that's where I think Biden has actually been very, very good in what he's been trying to do, which is to spend billions of dollars on infrastructure and on getting people back to work and giving them a perspective, and completely not engaging in this warfare with Republicans. Because, I mean, we can argue the politics at some other point, but from a scientific point of view, I think dealing with inequality and anxieties about society is absolutely the way forward, because these populists will get laughed out of town the moment people feel that they're secure in their lives. I think that's, who would have thought in 2010 or 2008, before the GFC, before the financial crisis, Trump would have been laughed out of town. He would have never found any traction. It was the global financial crisis that triggered the sense of insecurity. And there is statistical evidence throughout history, I think for the last 300 years, that any financial crisis for the next 20 years or so is followed by an increase in populism or populist streams, and all the consequences we're seeing now are statistically predictable simply on the basis of having had a financial crisis.
Heidi Blattman asks, do you have an explanation why the mood in the US and before in Britain changed so that Trump got elected and the Brexit endorsed?
Yeah,
I think that's actually what you said.
Yeah, effectively what I said. Now, I think there was a little more to it than that. There was also a lot of interference in the integrity of both of these elections through, political operatives on social media, including Russian bots and trolls and all that. Although I think the biggest culprits there were totally domestic. You can't blame all this on the Russians. That's ridiculous. But there were some domestic actors doing stuff that Facebook allowed them to do that no one knew about. And this is one of the biggest other problems that's a whole other talk, and I don't have time to talk about it now, but the role of social media algorithms and micro-targeting and the lack of regulation of the platforms and I'll pop another link into the chat if you're interested in that, to a report I just wrote together with others for the European Commission about the relationship between technology and democracy. And we go into that at length. And so I think a contribution definitely to Trump and Brexit was this social media machine that certain clever people could use for their purposes, with the opposition having no clue. Hillary Clinton had no clue what was going on Facebook. No one. And that was part of the problem. And that, I think, is what swung the election for Clinton. And the same is true for Brexit. So there is that added factor.
Mm-hmm. Finally, a question by Sarah. The last name is not spelled out. I have a question about the direction of future research. I agree that we need more research and compare the results across countries. However, if misinformation sticks and is so difficult to be retraced afterwards, what is your recommendation about sensible experimental methods for our research and studies on this issue?
Well, I think, lots. And the link I just put in the chat has a lot of that discussion in there. In a nutshell, I think the problem has to start at the source. We can't fix people or educate them to be able to update their memories. And by the way, why should we? You know, I think we have to reestablish some sense of, you know, expectation in a democracy that politicians and social media platforms shouldn't be out to destroy our lives. Let's start with that. How about we actually expect of the government to protect us against misinformation and lots of other things? And I think the moment you just say that, you can at least have a conversation about where the problem is coming from. And one of the problems, of course, is the attention economy online. I mean, the only reason Facebook exists is to sell you your data and your attention to advertisers. And that's how they make $1 quintillion a year. And what do we know from human attention? Well, we know that people pay attention to negative emotion and to outrage. So Facebook is a machine that is generating outrage and hatred. And we let that happen? Come on. I don't think so. We shouldn't. So that's, I think, where we have to go. And the recent revelations were very interesting, that the algorithm for the news feed weighted anger 5 times as much as positive emotion in people's likes. And so the more anger something attracted, the more likely it was to be shown to people. Well, what do you think is going to happen to a society if you do that? Well, people hate each other. What else could happen, right? So that, I think, is where we have to start, among many other places. And the only way to do that is to get, independent auditing capabilities so that independent scientists can audit the algorithms being used by the social media platform. And to my mind, that is the most important political battle of the 21st century, probably, because that is so crucial to everything that is happening. Because right now we're in a situation where the information diet of billions of people around the planet is determined by a dozen people in Silicon Valley who are writing algorithms for their own profit. Well, I don't think that's a very successful model of democracy, and we have to deal with that.
Stephan, thank you so much for this truly very interesting talk and stimulating and provocative. The only thing I can add to your final statement, which is actually should be final, is that perhaps, slowly we're all waking up, governments are waking up, the EU is waking up to this challenge. And yes, indeed, hopefully early enough before democracy is going down the drain. And
I totally agree. Hopefully early enough. I know it's happening. The European Commission is very serious about these issues now, but still, it's a long slog, and these very powerful platforms, and they'll oppose any of these measures. They don't want to be audited by independent agencies, but I think we have to ask for that.